Hello, everyone. This is Professor Rodriguez in the CIS 275 class for our Web Development 2. And today I want to show you how you can set up your own database and how to, play around with the PHP to retrieve things from the database and, even put things on your database at your own computer. So, one thing we have to make sure of to make things a little easier is that we have XAMPP installed already. I created a video telling you how to do this before. So we're just gonna go to XAMPP and we're gonna make sure that our Apache server is running and our MySQL server is running. Notice that in my computer, those are port 80 and 3306. Okay, so once we know those two are running, that means that we can start the MySQL. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can get into this MySQL database. One of them is by using the MySQL workbench, just like we do in school. You could set up your MySQL workbench and log into it and create databases just like you've done in your CIS 290, the databases class. But today I want to teach you something a little bit differently. So I'm going to create a new window over here for Chrome, and I'm just going to type localhost. Localhost, remember, is how we get to our own server. Now with XAMPP, it comes with something called MariaDB, which is just a version of MySQL. So if I do localhost / and I type php myadmin and I click enter, notice it's gonna bring me to a database, you know, that I have in this computer. So notice that right now the server type is MariaDB because that's what was installed with XAMPP. So from here, I can look at our databases that might already exist on my computer. Notice there's a test database and a test DB over here. Yours probably will just have the default ones, MySQL, PHP, MyAdmin, information schema. So we want to create a new schema. So create new, and we provide a name to the database, a name that we want. So in this case, we can call this database, for example, CIS 275 DB, or you can call it whatever you want. All right, it doesn't matter as long as you remember this name later. We're calling it CIS 275 DB. The second box, the drop down, is the encoding. In this case, I would leave it as Latin 1 Swedish CI. That's the type of keyboard I have, basically. Yours might default to something else. You can leave it as the default. Latin 1 Swedish CI would work, but for example, we could use UTF to be safe as well. Notice there's many UTF versions, but we could choose UTF-8 binary for the Unicode. This depends what characters you want to support. I'll just click create and notice that it creates this new database um, for me. Now with that database selected, I'm inside of the database and right now there are no tables. That means I have to create a new table. So for now, I'll just create a table called person. Um, Notice I put a capital P for this table, and I just want to have three columns. So person with three columns will have first name, last name, and maybe the date of birth. Just three things. And I'll click go down here. So this creates for me, well, this hasn't created the table yet, um, but it allows me to choose what are going to be these columns. So I could do, for example, first name for column 1 or for field 1, last name for field 2, and birth date for column 3. So then I can choose what type of, data I want to have. In this case, first name could be a varchar, maybe of length 30. Last name could be a varchar, also of length 30. And birth date could be a date, with no particular length or value. So from here, we could decide what's the default value for each of these. In this case, I don't really want to choose a default value, but we could put, for example, no, or we could put the current time. Uh, and if we want to, we can set different things like attributes, if it's binary, if it's signed or unsigned. I can decide whether these could be no, meaning empty. I could decide if this is a primary key, for example. In this case, uh, that's not necessary, although I might put primary key as first and last name. In your database that you're doing for your project, you definitely want primary keys. And then AI, meaning if you want to auto increment. If you're generating IDs, this would be the perfect place to choose AI. Um, if it's automatically created. And then if you want to write any comments, you want to move the columns and etc. So once you're done deciding, um, we can then click save. This will add the columns. This might give you these errors right now. That's okay. Probably something is off in my phpMyAdmin, but that's okay. It still created them, so I can ignore these errors for now. So now I have those three fields, but I don't have data. So to add data, we have to go to the Insert tab. Notice right now it shows me the table structure. I could look at relational views. I could look at the SQL code if I want to. I can search for data, which right now there's nothing. I can insert data. I can export, import, and set privileges and change different settings. We may go into those later, but for right now we just want to um, insert a value into this table, or two values in this case. So I'll just put my name, Joan Rodriguez, and an imaginary birth date, uh, because I don't want to give up my own birthday right now. So let's say I was born January 18th of 2017. Notice I can type the date by just putting the year first, the month, and then the date, the day, right? Followed by a dash. That's how it is stored as a date. Okay, so this would allow me to add two rows, so I could then go on to the next row, um, and maybe let's say Eric Cameron for Professor Cameron, and I don't really know his date of birthday, but also let's go with the joke that it's 2017 02 18. Let's say that's the case. So once we're done, we can insert this as a new row. So we just click on go. So notice that inserted the two rows, inserted these values into it. It actually also gives you what the SQL code is, right? So those two rows are now part of my table. How do I know? Well, because it says rows inserted, but also I could browse and see that those are the two data points in this table. So now those two are part of my table. Okay? So now I have, let's just recap. We have a CIS 275 DB schema. Inside of that, we have a table called person. And inside of this table, we just have these two data points. And I can add more by clicking Insert. So that sets up my database. The next part would be to retrieve the data from this database using PHP. So, this is very simple. Using your favorite uh, text editor, we can then create the PHP code for this. So I'm going to file save this using Notepad++, and I'm gonna look for my server files in my C drive, in my program, actually my XAMPP folder, and in my htdocs. That's where my server data is. So I'm gonna save this as a PHP file, and I'm gonna call this CIS275 practice.php. So this saves my file, so I can start writing our PHP. Remember that to um, connect to the database, we need to provide a few things. The first thing, I'm just gonna call it host, is our server name. So in this case, we use localhost. In class, we use cis.pccc.edu because we're actually hosting it somewhere. But with XAMPP, we are doing a local host. So that's all that's necessary here. The username should be root by default if you just used the default from XAMPP. The password should be empty. So we just put an empty quote. There is no password set up unless you put one. If that was the case, then you put the password in here. And then our database name, in this case, is CIS275DB. It matches it right here. So that's the connection information. So to connect to this, and I'm just gonna make this screen a little bigger, we have to create a connection. And we're gonna call this connection, oops, a auto filled. We're just gonna call it con to make it easy. And to create a connection, we have to use the new MySQL I to create a new object. So we're gonna have the host name, which is localhost, the username, which is the variable username, root, and then we're gonna pass the password, pass, which is empty, and we're gonna pass the database name, DB name. Alright, so this will pass and connect to our database. Um, and we're gonna check if connected. Alright, so we're gonna say if con, which is again our variable that has the connection, contains an error, connect error, then we're gonna say for now echo error could not connect to database, semicolon. Else, for now, we're just gonna say echo successful connection. Um, so let's test it. How do I test this? Well, let me put the code on one side and open our browser on the other side. I opened a new page. We're gonna go to localhost, which is our server, /. We're gonna call this file, which is in our htdocs folder, cis275 practice.php. Press enter, and right now it's telling me successful connection, which means I actually connected to the database. If yours says error, you have to go back and make sure that your connection is correct and that your username is actually root, and your database name is correct. If you go back to your database and you go back to home, you can see who the user is. This is the user, root, and this is the host name, localhost. If this is something else other than root, then you might have changed those settings when installing, and you have to use that username with the corresponding password. So to continue now, we want again to retrieve the data. So I'm gonna put a BR over here so that um, whatever message comes next go to the next line. So here we have to create our SQL query. And in this case, we just want to select everything. Select star from and then the database name. I'm selecting everything. That's why I chose star. You may select specific fields. So select from and the table name again. If I go back to my phpMyAdmin, the table name is person. So select star from person will select all of the data. All right. To run the query, we create a new variable which will have the result, and we set that equal to um, con, which is our connection, and inside of the connection we want to run the query. So we call the query function, which takes the SQL variable, which contains the SQL query. So that's what it's gonna perform. Um, we can create a while loop to retrieve the results, and we can just put the result inside of a variable called row. And while that variable exists, that means we have more data to retrieve. So this row is gonna contain whatever is in result, but we're gonna fetch it as an associative array. Remember from class that an associative array is one that allows us to um, look at the data by using the field names, first name, last name, birth date. So we can just echo everything in this row. So echo um, first name, first name, and we can put a column like that. We can put a dot for concatenation, and then we want to retrieve the row, and inside of the row, we want to get the first name, which is the name of our field. Dot. Um, then we go to the second row. Remember that when we're using the concatenation, we can press enter after it to go to the next line, and so that the code is still visible. So then we're gonna say last name dot row last name, which is the last name field from your database. Dot. Now, I'm gonna put a BR in front of this, by the way, just so this actually appears on another line. And then BR forward slash birthday dot row um, birth date. Um, and then I'll put another dot. And then just to separate the records, I'm gonna create another BR and I'm gonna create a H uh um let's just do kind of like a bunch of dashes like that and then semicolon. So notice that this is always part of one message. If you would prefer, you could do 4 different echoes instead of having this dot at the end. That's totally fine as well. But now that we have this code over here, it should be fine. One more thing we should do though, at the end of your PHP, before the PHP ends, we make sure that the connection closes. We don't want to leave this database connection open after the program ends. So we would say com arrow close to call the close method. And we can test it again. So we're back to localhost cis275 practice.php, and I will refresh. Notice that it gives me successful connection, first name for the first person, last name, and birthday for the second person as well. And we notice here that the first name is appearing over there, which means maybe we can also do a BR over here. Okay, and then refresh, and notice that it now looks a little bit better. So with this, we're able to use our own databases. I hope that you found this useful, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me by email uh, as soon as possible. I hope you have a good day and that you learned something new.